So we want to tidy some non-tidy data. So here's an example of some non-tidy data that we might want to tidy. So here we have income distribution by religion. So each row here is a religion. And then over here in the columns, we have the number of people in that religion who earn money in this amount, in this bin, right? So this is called a count table. It's not tidy. Notice that each column is a value, not a variable. Here we have two variables. Here we have religion and income, and then also the number of people in that thing. And so each column is a value, right, as opposed to being a variable. So we have one variable spread across multiple columns. How can we turn this into tidy data? So here's another example of a very common case where we have a category in each column. Right? So here's another example of non-tidy data. So here we have a month and also the sales in our goods, sales of goods, and also sales of services at our company. So in this case, we have our variable, our observation level should be by department by date or by month. And instead, we have just one row per date, and we have the department split across multiple columns. This could mess us up if we say we wanted to categorize things by the category variable, and so we're going to want to tidy this data as well. How can we do that? So there are a lot of approaches to tidying data, and it varies depending on what kind of data you are trying to tidy, what structure it currently is in. But there are two really important ones, and these are the only two that I'm going to do: the pivot and the join. So we're going to start with pivoting. So the first big tool in the tidying toolbox is the pivot. What a pivot does is it takes a single row with k columns and turns it into k rows with one column. Sort of like our sales in each year thing, right? It would take sales in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, and it would turn it into sales in 2011, 2012, 2013, and then the value there. This can also be called going from wide format data, where we have a single variable split across multiple columns, depending on a value, into long data, which is one row per observation. You can also go the other direction, long to wide, which is useful in some cases. And I will point out, this is our goal here, to go from that wide data to that long data. And doing so is difficult. This is a tricky command to use, and it's not our fault. Pivot commands are notoriously difficult to use in pretty much every language. So this is definitely a kind of function where you're going to want to do a little bit of trial and error, check if what you did worked properly. Definitely don't assume that you got it right on the first try. Even seasoned researchers do not do that. Okay, so we want to tidy this data. Let's make sure that we're following our steps, or we're thinking about it. We looked at the data. We saw sort of what it looks like here. We know what it looks like. We know that we have one row per date and then one column per department and our sales data in it. We also thought about how we want the data to look. We want one row per category and month, right, because those are our key variables. And then we want a column for the actual sales value. So here's the question. How can we carry information from where it is to where we want it to be? We have currently two columns, and we want it to be one column with a variable indicating department. We can do this with a pivot that goes from wide to long. And then, of course, afterwards, we will check our result and probably go back and fix the code, because getting a pivot right on the first try in any language is hard to do. So how can we perform a pivot? Well, in the Tidyverse, we have two big functions, pivot longer and pivot wider. These are relatively new functions, so if you just Google for how to pivot in R or Tidyverse, you might get other functions. I'd recommend using these instead. They're much nicer. So we're going to go from wide to long, so we're going to use pivot longer to make the data longer. What it's going to ask for is a couple things. It's going to ask for the data that we are working with, of course, and so it's going to ask for the columns to pivot. What are the columns that are currently in wide format that we want to turn to long format? So that looks like our sales columns are the ones that we're going to want to take from wide to long. This, on the other hand, is our identifying variable, so we're going to keep that the same. It's going to ask for names too. So when we pivot, what we have right now, we have sales of goods, and we got sales of services, right? When we make it longer, we're going to have two columns as well. We're going to have one that determines what department we're looking at. Are we looking at goods or services? What are we going to call that? That variable needs a name as well. And then we have one column with the sales data itself. What are we going to call that? So those are going to be determined by names too, which is going to give us the name of the variable that's goods or services, and then values too, which is the name of the variable that actually stores the values. There are of course many other options for doing this. Just see pivot longer for more information. All right, so let's do a pivot on this data. So I've got this sales goods and services data stored in a data set called multicat. I'm going to pipe that along to pivot longer. That'll be our data set. And then what I need to do, I need to tell it what columns I want to pivot to longer. I need to tell it what I want the name of the goods services variable to be, and also what the name of the values variable is going to be. we look at this, we can see that now we have one row per month per department, and then we have the different sales values in those different things, right? So if we look back, we see that we had 4 and 4 in January, 5 and 9 in February, 1 and 2 in March. And if we look here, we can see, again, 4 and 4, 5 and 9, 1 and 2, as we'd expect. Now, one thing that I did here, by the way, is this. I said starts with. So there are a number of functions in the tidyverse that make it easy to select multiple variables at the same time. These are called tidy select functions. One of them is starts with. If I say starts with sales, it will pick all of the columns in my data that start with the phrase sales underscore, which of course was my sales goods and my sales services columns. So I've picked my columns to convert from wide to long by telling it that, hey, all the columns that I want to convert from wide to long start with the phrase sales underscore. And in doing so, I've pivoted my data. We might also, another type of data we might have to pivot, in this case from long to wide, might be a case where we have variables that are stored as rows. This is something that you commonly see, especially in like accounting data or like tax forms or things like that. So in this case, we have data where each variable is a row, as opposed to being a column. So here we have person is James Acaster, their income was this, their deductible was this, their AGI was this. Now this is clearly not tidy because we have one row per variable as opposed to one column per variable. We can fix this with pivot wider, and then if we had multiple individuals that were all like this and we pivoted them all wider, we could bind them all together with bind rows. Bind rows is basically a function that stacks one data set on top of another. So what pivot wider needs the data, of course. It needs the ID columns. These are the columns that give us the key. Basically, what is the variable that's going to be the key variable that we're looking for. Names from, what column contains the names of the variables that we're creating. So in this case, we want these to be the names of our new variables. So that's going to be where the names from comes from. And the values from, which column contains the values. Here are the values that we want to be in our data. We've looked at the data, we see how it looks. We thought about how we want it to look. We want one column per person, one column for income, one column for deductible, one column for AGI. We want James Acaster, 112, 24,000, 88,000, right? So that's what we want it to look like. So when we do this, we tell it that we want to get those names from the tax form row and the values from the value. We get exactly what we want. We get the person, income, deductible, and AGI variables. And we got James Acaster and all the different values here. Notice, by the way, that these are all string variables, which we don't necessarily want at this point. But that's because we started out with all of these values being in this column right here, where one of them is a string, so it converts all of them to strings. So we need to convert all these back to numeric if we wanted it a little later. All right, so that is how we can perform a pivot. So when we have data where we have the same variable stored across multiple columns, which is the most common time when you'll need to pivot, we can use pivot longer to make it into one column of values and one column of identifiers. There are also other applications for when we might need to pivot, one of which is when we have variables stored as rows. In that case, we'll need to go from long to wide.